Now, we saw today the US president making the case to Congress for a funding boost, $100 billion, in part for ongoing military support for Israel. How would Israel utilise this?
So there are a lot of systems that are required, first and foremost, for the protection of Israeli civilians. As the president mentioned, Iron Dome will work to intercept the thousands of rockets that are coming across. Just today, there were rocket strikes that injured and killed civilians, or at least severely injured them in Kiryat Shmona in the north. And Iron Dome, among other systems, will be necessary to deal with that. Additionally, both Hamas and Hezbollah have made significant use of unmanned aerial vehicles coming across the border, both for surveillance and reconnaissance, as well as targeting and strike. And the aid will go to help systems that counter those. But beyond that, urban operations of the kind we can expect in a ground operation in Gaza are very resource intensive in terms of ammunition, in terms of protective gear, in terms of medical supplies, in terms of precision-guided munitions and specific forms of ammunition and systems and grenades that are really needed for this kind of operation. Only great powers, such as the United States, have the ability to maintain and produce these at scale. So as operations shift into a ground operation, Israel is going to need resupply in a similar way to what we've seen in Ukraine, with a similar level of intensity, albeit perhaps with different systems.
Dr. Stoil, I'll ask you more about that imminent ground invasion in just a moment. But before that, Joe Biden also said that he'd spoken to the families of hostages, and he says that they're pursuing every avenue to bring the hostages home. What hope do they have?
Well, let's start by making it very clear that the taking of hostages is a war crime under international law. And under international law, Hamas has an absolute requirement to ensure the safety of those hostages and to return them unharmed to their families. In past, hostages have been exchanged as part of negotiations around a ceasefire and even during conflicts and operations. That said, because of the large amount of hostages taken by Hamas, and honestly, because a number of them are quite elderly and very young, especially near infants and toddlers and people well over 60, there are lots of complications in hoping for their survival and in hoping for their safe return. However, I know Israel is quite concentrated on this. I know Israel is doing everything it can to bring the hostages back, and I know they enjoy the support of the international community in that.
Now, to this imminent Israeli ground assault in Gaza, what will it look like?
We've already seen the first phases of the preparation for a ground assault. This, in military terms, is known as shaping. This is what you're seeing with a lot of the airstrikes, attempting to negate some of the defensive advantages Hamas has, remove communications nodes, arms stockpiles, and intelligence and surveillance systems, as well as to start to degrade the level of fortification Hamas has built in Gaza. Hamas, as the quasi-government of Gaza, certainly the people in authority over Gaza over the last several years, has had a large and significant chance to incorporate their defenses into civilian infrastructure to make it much, much more difficult for the Israelis to operate. The second phase we saw was a reconnaissance in force, where Israeli troops briefly entered Gaza to try to understand and anticipate what they would see ahead of them. And in the raid, they captured a large number of Hamas systems, including devices known as explosively formed penetrators, which often were in Iraq, owed their existence to Iranian influence. These are very, very, very powerful anti-vehicle explosives and improvised explosive devices, or IEDs. There are also anti-tank guided missiles and a lot of drones. So when you get into the density of urban combat, you're dealing with a highly rubbleized environment. So there's a lot of rubble around. If you picture a construction site that's partially collapsed, any construction worker can tell you this is a dangerous environment, even without enemies hiding among civilian population in basements on top of roofs firing at you. In addition to that, Hamas has built a significant network of subterranean constructs, of tunnels, of bunkers, of underground supply caches, and places from which they can ambush Israeli forces. So ultimately, the nature of urban warfare ends up being a very close fight and a fight that requires combined arms. So Israel will be using armored bulldozers, combat engineers, tanks, and infantry, all operating very closely together in the same battle space and at short range from where Hamas is operating. And unfortunately, because Hamas has not let the civilians leave North Gaza en masse, where civilians are also going to be seeking shelter.
Is the Israeli Defence Force capable of this urban warfare? We know that there have been intelligence failures as part of this attack by Hamas, and also this is a different style of attack and using a lot of reservists.
So one thing to understand is that for the Israeli military, unlike the Australian military or the US military, their warfighting arm are their reservists. Some of these reservists will in fact have experience fighting in Gaza previously. So that counts in their favor of an ability to conduct urban operations. They have not been idle over the last 10 days since they cleared Hamas out of the borders of Israel, since they drove Hamas into Gaza. These forces have been preparing, have been training, have been planning. Additionally, Israel has some of the highest level of experience at urban operations. With all that said, and while I do believe they are very capable of prevailing in this conflict, we should make no mistake in understanding that urban operations are difficult, and we should expect to see a large number of Hamas casualties. We should expect to see Israeli casualties, and we should expect to see civilian casualties. And I think as the recent missile strike or missile failure really into the area near a hospital has shown, one of the other key parts of urban operations that could affect the whole picture is they become very clouded from an information standpoint. It's very, very difficult, much more so than in operations in rural or open environments, to identify what is actually happening at any given time, in part because of the close constraints. And so it will be hard for us as observers, for the media, to have a really clear impression on what's happening as well.
Urban warfare expert Dr. Jacob Stoil from the Modern War Institute. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.